started, and we'll see if some other people join us soon. It's a pleasure to speak with all of you today. Isabel and I are here to talk on the topic of ethnographic lexicons, both to speak to our own experiences with their development and modification, and also to start initiating a broader conversation. We are part of a lexicon task force that was recently formed through the Registrar's Committee of the American Alliance of Museums. And the origins of this presentation can actually be found on the Registrar's listserv when, back in 2014, a question about classification terms for anthropological collections led to a conversation on thesauri development. And in the course of that conversation, there was a general recognition that there's no universally recognized list of ethnographic object names or cultural names, and that as a result, museums resort to developing their own unique thesauri and vocabulary lists. And while these lists meet the needs of the individual museum, they do render it somewhat difficult to share data between institutions, and that also requires visiting researchers to familiarize themselves with terms unique to each institution. And this is really counterproductive to the larger museum professional goals of improved data sharing and access to collections across institutions. So as our discussion continued beyond that initial listserv posting, it was decided to launch a collaborative effort to reach some solutions regarding standardized terms for ethnographic collections. And to reach out to voices beyond the Registrar's listserv, we decided to start bringing that conversation to various conferences in order to raise this topic among invested communities. We've previously presented at the AAM conference in 2015, also a session called Developing an Ethnographic Lexicon. We'll be at ARCS again in November. And the session at AAM also sort of served as our first task force gathering. While we're still in the development phase, the task force currently consists of our chair, Charlie Iverson, collections technician at the Minnesota Museum of Science, Isabel Tovar, the associate registrar and database administrator at the Denver Art Museum, Nicolette Meister, she's curator of collections at the Logan Museum of Anthropology at Beloit College, and myself, I'm Amy Heggemeyer. I'm assistant registrar at the Spurlock Museum, which is a world cultures museum at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So now you know who we all are, including the ones that aren't here. So, am I going to do this right? There we go. Okay. So one of the first questions that the force was looking at in this discussion was, what do we mean when we're using these words? Lexicon, vocabulary, thesaurus. Are we using them correctly? Are they interchangeable? So just break down these terms a bit for you. Lexicon, Merriam-Webster defines that as the vocabulary of a particular language or field. So it's a dictionary of terms that's used within a particular profession or a particular subject. Now, similarly, nomenclature is an organized system of names within a particular field of study. So within the museum field, Nomenclature 3.0, or now Nomenclature 4.0, is a system for classifying man-made objects. Then we have controlled vocabulary, and that is a list of terms that can contain preferred or variant terms. You can also sometimes have an approved terms list, which would identify a single preferred term. And then we have thesaurus, which is considered a controlled vocabulary that's arranged in a hierarchical layout. So it takes that controlled vocabulary list and creates a structure that presents a synonymous, hierarchical, and associative relationships between the terms. So from our discussion of that, our determination was that lexicon and nomenclature are largely interchangeable terms, with thesaurus and controlled vocabulary having a more specified but a similar meaning. Now, our next step was to try and get a picture of what's happening within the collections community at large. And to that end, the task force members created a survey to gather information on museum practices regarding standardized ethnographic terminology. So, titled the Ethnographic Terminology Survey, we sought to identify what types of institutions work with various ethnographic collections and how they address their classification terms. This was released in April 6th of 2015. It's still active. If you or your institution have not participated in this, we do encourage you to provide your input, and this is the link to that survey. So it's a 12-question survey that begins by establishing the respondent's museum structure, its type, its size, and governance. We then asked what kinds of materials are housed within the museum, looking specifically at what types of ethnographic and archaeological collections are at hand. The concluding questions seek information about the types of database systems. Are you using KEMU, Past Perfect, Argus, and also types of terminology? Are you using Getty, Nomenclature? Are you developing something in-house? Now, as of August 26th of this year, we've received 70 responses from institutions covering a wide range of sizes, both budgetary and collection sizes, and also a range of governance structures. And I would say that the results so far mimic what we had pretty much observed anecdotally, which is when it comes to these types of collections, a recognized and reliable source for object names and cultural names is missing, and we're all trying to do the best we can with the resources we have to fill that gap. So I'm going to focus on a few points from this survey, and I've also brought a slide of the results to date to share if you wish. The questions I'm particularly interested in today are questions 8 through 11, which look at database choice, terminology selection, and list sharing between institutions. Okay. So with question 8, as you can see, out of our respondents, the most commonly used collections management system is PastPerfect. PastPerfect's pretty big name in the field out there. And out of curiosity, I took a look at PastPerfect's use among tribal museums and cultural centers. I did this by taking a look at their client list, which is available on the PastPerfect website. And it's not going to be an entirely accurate number because they don't list every single client on their list, but it gave us a good idea of how many tribal archives and museums are potentially using PastPerfect, and as a result also Nomenclature. So taking a look at their list by state for tribal museums, archives, and cultural centers, I identified 40 separate institutions that are using PastPerfect for their collections management system. That's a pretty significant number. Now, as you can see on this list here, the second most commonly selected collections management system was Other. And as you can see, we said, please specify. And taking a closer look at that, Other entailed a range of responses, and no two responses were alike. Some of those others mentioned were Embark, Mimsy, Museums Plus, Collection Space. So we're looking at a really wide range of collections management systems and also digital asset management systems at work within the museum world here. Okay. So question 9 really provides an interesting look at the usage of standardized terminologies across museums. As I mentioned, as you saw previously, PastPerfect was the most selected answer for question 8, so it's not too surprising that Nomenclature then shows up in question 9 as the most commonly used terminology system, as PastPerfect comes with Nomenclature installed or has the option to come with Nomenclature installed. However, an interesting aspect of this question is that multiple responses were allowed from a single respondent. So in many of the cases, the responses were not Nomenclature on its own, but Nomenclature combined with Getty Thesaurus, Nomenclature combined with Library of Congress, Getty combined with Library of Congress, and developed in-house. A lot of Nomenclature combined with developed in-house. And that really, I think, reflects what different types of collections that are residing within a single institution. You're going to have archaeological, anthropological, and even art or archive collections. They're all managed by the same collections management system, but are needing to be documented using different vocabularies. And a third interesting response I noticed on here was none. Looking at that number of none it's a pretty good percentage. And that tells me that what we're going to need to do as a task force is take a look at how many institutions are deciding against using an established terminology altogether, because none of the existing ones are compatible to their collection without a serious amount of in-house modification. So now question 10 takes a closer look at that in-house developed response from the previous question and gives us an idea of what types of vocabularies are being developed by institutions. Now, out of the options listed, object name, as you can see, was the most commonly selected, followed by cultural groups. And now, I find that interesting because object name is a term that's addressed in so many of the standard terminologies that already exist. So why are so many respondents having to develop their own lists, particularly if they're using a pre-existing lexicon? And I think that sort of shows us that museums are making a use of established terminologies, but are needing to make modifications in order to make it work for all of the objects in their collection. And I can understand that to a certain degree, every museum collection is unique. And creating a term or terms to merge a specialized collection into a larger classification system is perfectly understandable. But I mean, looking at the number of institutions here at this conference alone, makes it clear that anthropological material culture collections are not a niche or a specialist collection held by just a few. So when we're all continuing to create our own institution-specific additions to establish terminology, it's not really efficient, and it's not encouraging a uniformity of terms across collections, which is what we really need to encourage this institutional information sharing. One last bar graph, and then we're done with the bar graphs. So I'm going to take a close out a look at our survey here with this question. One of the questions we asked here is, do you share your set of standardized terms with other museums? And we got a pretty big no. Yeah. And that's something the task force and I are really curious to learn more information about behind this no. My first question is it a matter of semantics? Because we asked, do you share them rather than would you share them? Is it if they had the opportunity, would they be willing to? But is there something more at play there? Are individuals afraid to share their institutional list because of concerns of, intellectual property or other concerns with sharing their museum's property with other groups? Is there a fear that the list that you've developed isn't good enough to share with the wider museum community at present? My own thought on this, and I'm curious to really dive into this more and find out where that no is coming from, is I wonder if some of it's that same reason a lot of institutions don't like to share their in-house forms, which is a combination of those two issues, the concern of sharing your intellectual property with others, and also it not being the perfect form that everyone wants to see. For that latter one, I think it's really going to be to everyone's advantage to sort of get past this concern that what we're sharing with others isn't perfect, because if we do have this opportunity to share my vocabulary list with your vocabulary list and compare and contrast, we can get an opportunity to see what sorts of trends are emerging on what types of terms are being used, and we can work together to create a more uniform list. So to give you a bit of example with mine, I don't know how many of you get to use Nomenclature. Are any of you familiar with that? This is a page from revised Nomenclature, which was published in 1988, and it's from the museum I work at, Spurlock, and as you can see, most of our pages look something like this from the 88 edition. So what we've observed is that while many classification systems exist, they often require some significant modification in order to incorporate non-European material cultures into that system. So as I mentioned, Nomenclature is the one I work with daily. Nomenclature 3.0 has been out for a while, and just as of this summer, Nomenclature 4.0 has come out. I have not had an opportunity to work with 4.0, but my understanding is it has an increased number of ethnological and archaeological terms, and I'm really excited to see what they've got added in there now. So given the diversity of Spurlock's world culture collections and that they leaned more toward a historical and daily use focus rather than that of a fine or decorative arts focus, Nomenclature was determined to be the best fit for classification purposes when we developed our FileMaker Pro database system in 2000. So this is what we've been working with starting in 2000, making lots of entries. Now, transitioning from the revised to 3.0 in 2012 really provided us an excellent opportunity to review our 45,000 accession record classifications for accuracy or updating. And I really loved making the transition to 3.0. Revised to 3.0, they went from 2 hierarchical levels to 3 hierarchical levels, which really allowed for a greater depth of detail and organization within our database. And also about 2/3 of the terms that we had written into our previous copy did exist in 3.0. However, and the reason that we're here today is that there really is still some work to be done. Now, while going through the process from revised to 3.0, changing from that 2 hierarchical to the 3 hierarchical level, and it was me. I got to look at every single record for an entire summer. It was fun, but very busy. I noticed that terminology accuracy tended to fall into 3 categories. First of all, we could have a perfect match. It's a door, it's a hammer. Nice and simple. Second of all, we had situations where it was a relational match. So for example, we have artifacts from a Chinese scholar's desk, one that was listed in our system as a scroll weight, but it's a type of scroll weight that sits on the desk to hold the scroll down on the desk. Essentially, it's a paperweight. Scroll weight, paperweight, we use the paperweight terminology listing within 3.0. But there were still quite a few that were either no listing, for example, in 3.0, Buddhist monks' robes. There was no listing whatsoever, so we had to create that listing. Or there was an imprecise listing. And a good example I have of that is we have a fair number of molas in our collection. If you're familiar with those, they are an applique textile panel created by the Cuna of the San Blas Islands in Panama. And they are listed in Nomenclature 3.0 as an art piece, and they are often collected as art pieces. However, these textile panels are part of the women's blouses. It's part of an article of clothing. And we have several examples of the panels, but we also have several examples of the blouses themselves. And we wanted to reflect that traditional usage, the blouse usage. So we made the decision to list all of our molas, both the square panels and the full blouses, as articles of clothing. So how does a registrar or a collections manager address this third issue, that of either having no listing or having an imprecise listing? Well, if you must do this, and my experience with nomenclature tells me that you must do this, then what you do is, first of all, you want to identify the classification structure that you're wishing to emulate. Secondly, you're going to take a look at that object and carefully research its function in order to identify its full use or uses, and then you're going to want to create your term or terms. And I'm using that plural because so many of the objects that we're looking at in these collections are multi-use items. And in order to document them fully, we really need to document this multifunctionality. So through ample assistance of our staff, using qualified researchers and students, which is a really big advantage of working at an academic institution, we will proceed to select an object or a series of objects and begin our research. We will reference scholarly publications and, as often as possible, bring in members of source communities to help us learn about the objects in our care and their many uses before making out a list like you can see here. So as I said, I'm located at an academic institution, and it really can come to your advantage to see who within your community is helpful as an assistant. Volunteers, if you can find a retired librarian, they are so well organized, and they really love, a lot of them, all the ones I've met anyway, really love to do research on the side and can really be helpful in creating this type of structure if you're looking to create something like this within your institution. The example I have here was created by a graduate student from the School of Library and Information Science. Her name was Summer Pelsar. We hired her as an intern for a semester, and she took a look at various Greek vessels within our collection. She organized them by their primary function after conducting extensive research as to what their primary function was, and then presented us with this list of possible nomenclature compliant terms. And we are so grateful for the work that she put into this. It was an entire semester's worth of work for one small component of our collection. And that's one of the issues of having to create your own additions to an existing lexicon, is that it's really a time-consuming project with regards to staff time and resources, not to mention financial if you are looking to hire a contract employee or a paid intern to conduct this work. And she did an excellent job for us, but in the end, this solution is staying with us in-house unless we share it with others. So there's no guarantee that the objects that you have like this within your collection are going to match, that your listings are going to match the objects we have in our collection. So these are some of the methods that we've applied, but they're an imperfect solution, and we really want to work with all of you to find a more perfect solution. And that really comes to why we're here at this conference today, because when we're creating these terms and definitions for collections management usage, an important goal of the task force is for us to make sure we're incorporating the voice of source communities within the museum database. When we're attempting to classify these multi-use and multifaceted objects using limited non-source terms, we're not documenting them as accurately as we can. And by incorporating source community terms for object names and cultural groups into the museum databases, that's going to encourage visitors, researchers, and museum professionals to look at these objects from that source community perspective, which hasn't always been as well addressed as it should have been. And I really want to stress we're not looking for input, we're looking for collaboration and involvement. We want to create something that works as much for you as it works for us and for any other institution. The task force is really striving to form a collaborative group of museum professionals representing different types of institutions that maintain material, cultural, and archaeological collections. And as you can see from our survey, we've got a pretty complex task ahead of us. We're looking to see if we can develop a standard that's compatible with different database systems and also within existing classification systems like Getty and Nomenclature and National Park Service. And ultimately, we're really looking to show that ethnographic and archaeological collections are not specialist or niche subjects, but that they exist across a wide range of museums and collections. So really, source community terms are a valuable and useful addition to any lexicon. And I'm hopeful that together today we can start creating some long-term solutions. I said it earlier and I'll say it again, we're all trying to do the best we can with the resources that we have. And the Lexicon Task Force, it's our goal to improve the resources that we have, and we're hoping to work with you to make that possible. Thank you.
feedback later on. Good morning, everybody. So I'm going to, how did you get your paper to stay up here?
Yeah, about there.
Okay. So yes, Amy has done a wonderful job introducing the task force. We'll come back around to talk a little bit more about that at the end of my section. I wanted to come at this from a slightly different perspective, as opposed to object names specifically, but from a culture group name side, which is what I ended up working quite a bit on. And just so you have my background, I'm currently at the Denver Art Museum, but the previous 15 years of work for me was as a collections manager and a NAGFRA coordinator doing cultural patrimony work, so doing a lot of work trying to incorporate better culturally appropriate care into museum collections, and also trying, I mean, this is part of where this came from, was trying to make the database work better, not just for the museum, but for the community groups that were trying to get information from the museums. So this is the perspective that we're coming from. And Amy already mentioned that we clearly are here. We're trying to collaborate so that this really is a tool that is useful not just to the museum community in a traditional way, but in a larger, broader definition of museum. So this is my little case study. And I apologize ahead of time. I'll try not to lose my voice. My particular case study was when I was the collections manager, NAGFRA coordinator at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and we found ourselves, we were using Argus, and we were faced with having to find a solution to a different database system. And I'm assuming that we're all familiar with poorly entered data into a variety of fields. We had fields that had grown kind of organically over time. People had entered data in different parts. Whenever I received requests for information from people, I ended up having to do just several different keyword searches in several different fields, et cetera. And so it was a labor of, it just felt really silly that we were having to try and just find all these little crumbs hidden in the corners to make sure that we were finding everything that people would be interested in reviewing. And so when we were given this opportunity and we did a lot of manual fixing for several years. I had a group of volunteers, and we just kept going through and trying to fix things. And as Amy mentioned, it was one of those systems that had organically at some point had been the Chanel nomenclature system for object names. And then it had just kind of evolved from there as people added terms and did things that, just to make the system work. And so when we had this opportunity to move to a new system, we thought, okay, well, this is a time where maybe we can load a good, solid standard that we can go from into the future. I thought very happily, thinking that I was going to find something. And as I kept looking around, and part of it was we were having to do this for both object name and for culture group. I mean, clearly we had a lot of outdated cultural group names that we wanted to update, and I just could not find. It was really challenging. I couldn't find anything, and I ended up choosing, because of the time frame that I was given, to focus on the cultural group side and leave the object name for a little later on. And what that led me to was to NMAI, and the fact that they had already done quite a bit. And this is so, in case some of you haven't seen this resource, it is online at their website. If you go into the collections area, and then there's and by the way, I should mention that this is being recorded and will be on the website for Sustainable Heritage Network. Thank you, Sustainable Heritage Network. So if you want to find the PowerPoint and download these reference slides with the links for things that'll be there for you. So this is online. You can go and review, and they have culture group names, they have object, they have material types, media, all that stuff. And it's a reference list that you can scan through. This was all work that was done in collaboration. They actually went through and reviewed their collections and spoke with different communities. And so that part of the work was done, and not that it's ever done necessarily, but had already been, quite a bit of it had been done. And so the other part of it too was that they are the program we were moving into was KEEMU, and NMAI uses KEEMU. And so I was able to ask the folks there to send it to me in an Excel spreadsheet. One of the joys of being a database person is you spend way too much time in spreadsheets. But it's a nice way to control things, and you can see how it's the same, if you look back here, how things are set up in a kind of hierarchical system. This is how it appears on an Excel sheet. The branches kind of open up based off of continent and then going in from there. They were able to send me their list in the hopes that I would be able to just load that into our system, do the migration, and I mean that was kind of going to be like the present if we were going to be able to do that. And I started working through that. And the thing with a lot of this is to keep in mind that you're trying to maintain the history of the institution and the terms that were used previously that might have appeared. I had situations where people were looking to see lists that had been provided as part of the initial NAGPRA inventories and summaries that things were showing up under a certain group and now had changed. So you want to maintain some of the historical aspects of what an institution has used in the past, but at the same time have the newer terms incorporated. And so that's what you're seeing, a lot of things in parentheses. And also, they were coding things by whether things were italicized and in yellow. And I mean, they have we won't get into it. We had a lot of emails back and forth about how they coded everything to work within their system. So the problem became, so clearly their material is only for the Americas. And for me at DMNS, I actually had to do this for the entire world. So I was kind of like, I had to do different things for different continents. But this was a huge start. I don't think we showed the slide from our survey of where collections were coming from for people who responded, but the majority of respondents, the majority of their collections are from the Americas. So that's partially why we're starting with this part of the world. And this is just a slightly different viewpoint. So you can see, again, how terms were decided upon as far as whether they were valid. And the valid-invalid term situation is a database-specific thing, too, that we have to address, of how individual databases handle different terms, alternate terms, quote-unquote, invalid versus valid. So this is essentially how they had developed their system. And you can see this side over here, the invalid terms that have all the different pipe separators. These are all these different terms that they had gone through and decided, all right, we're not going to use these anymore. Those are the acceptable terms, et cetera. But we still want to document these because someone might be looking at an old catalog card and find a term and have to be able to find it somehow. And you want to incorporate too, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, is you need to have the ability for, depending on who your users are, that people who maybe are not as well informed as far as more contemporary terms, that they would also be able to find records. So, are you going to search by Navajo or are you going to search by Dene? And that, can you find everything you need by searching on either one of those terms? And questions like that we have to address. So, in the end, after a couple months of looking through the NMAI list and realizing that we had our own set of in-house terms that were not matching up, I realized that I couldn't use NMAI's system. So I had to start from scratch. I used it as a reference point. And so I had to pull all our terms out and start working from that perspective, because I had to accomplish this in about 6 months. So we went through the terms that you see in black are terms that exist in the database that we had to somehow maintain during that migration and subsequent work. I went through and just made sure that anything that needed to be updated was updated. So the terms in red I added in so that they would be available after the migration occurred, that we could just link in there and then that would be updated. And that was all based off of NMAI's work. And so a lot of this too, I did a lot of just keeping track of why decisions were made. I feel like that's a very important part of all this, is making sure that you explain the choices that you've made, because often we're all dealing with systems and situations where you wonder why something is the way it is. And sometimes there could be a very good reason. One of the other things I wanted to point out too was that the database-specific issue of whether or not it can handle special accents and things like that, special letters. And some databases can and some can't. And so that's another thing that we're throwing into the pot of figuring out how to address this, that if we develop something and it has a special cedille something on the C, is that something that's manageable by someone else's database? Let's see. Oh, and so just to finish out that last slide, I loaded the finished list my last day of work there, so I didn't get to test it, and the new database was up for about a month, and then I loaded it, and then I left. And so God bless the collections manager that came after me, who has been, she was the one who was tasked with really beta testing it. And she's been doing a lot of adjusting and, real life, because part of what had to happen was all the data migrated over, and then we had to go back and link all the different records, and there's about 60,000 records of, finding all the records that had Clinkit. All right, now we're going to link to this new term, et cetera. And they've still been having issues with getting the database to work properly. So it's a work in progress. But so here's the thing, so now I'm at the Art Museum. This is a little snapshot of the internal culture name group, part of the lexicon. We don't know where it came from. It's, it's as far as a standard goes, I don't know what it was based off of. And we've been doing a lot. There's a lot of outdated terms in it. I've been working with the collections manager to try and figure out ways to update these terms properly, so that not only are the items labeled properly in the storage areas for when people come to visit, but within the database as well, that they're documented properly. But again, we've been having to do it one by one, and I'm kind of stuck because I feel like I'm being faced with this again. This is how I found myself as part of this conversation about a year ago, because I thought, I'm going to have to do this again in another museum with its own set of unique weirdnesses. We really should not have to do this over and over and over again. There really should be a larger solution to this. And so essentially it's the same, and I feel like this is what happens in pretty much every museum. It's organic, you just figure it out. You don't have enough time to do it, so you just enter a quick term thinking you've got a correct one, and it's not. And so here we are. So this is what we're trying to address. So what I wanted to throw around were some of the discussion points that we had about what the project is trying to do and what we want help with. Because what we're trying to do really is gather a group of people that have such a variety of backgrounds that we can really kind of crack this nut. Either from a technology perspective or a cultural perspective or any perspective. And so the things that we're trying to keep track of are in the individual quirks category, including things that, not just the internal words that were used historically in an institution, but I'm sure everybody's familiar with the very generic things like Latin American, or the things that have question marks at the end, the attributed to or uncertains and things like that. So we have to be able to have something that's flexible enough to really handle the poor objects that, you know, have no information, that have ended up in museum collections, poorly documented, and we have to somehow still maintain those to be able to find them so we can work with them. As far as so for collaboration and resources, obviously that we want this to not just be about mainstream traditional museums coming together and making yet another resource that we can use, but to really have this be something that is truly functional across a variety of entities, and that really will bring in, I mean, part of this is an example I have from working with some of the representatives from Ashiwiawan and the Zuni community, that we had people come to DMNS and we walked through the collection. And so now we have a group of all the Kachinas that were in the collection. They very clearly asked for the Zuni ones to be renamed such that they actually held culturally appropriate terms. And that was one of those unique terms that I created in our lexicon that's not captured anywhere else. So now there's this little subset, and I don't know if that was the right way to do it or not. You know, do you make it a subterm? Do you make it a side term? You know, things like that. Questions where what we want to do is bring the community voice in a way that they're comfortable with how something is being described in the museum, but then also so that the museum's able to find the things appropriately as well. And I already talked about documenting. The other thing that I wanted to point out too was that one of the things I found was that it's really hard sometimes to decide how you're doing culture, as far as, are you talking about, is it group, is it geopolitical? Are you putting boundaries on it? Are you talking about locality information that for some people is very important to have it be included in their naming conventions? Sometimes not. And depending on the part of the world, that shifted how we were able to do those designations. The archaeological cultures question also came up, because we really struggled with how to, again, within the database, how are you distinguishing, if at all, between culture, you know, is it modern day contemporary, or is it archaeological? And everybody seemed to have a different opinion about how to handle that. And sometimes you're able to control that by having all the cultural material be together, but then just differentiating, say, by the date information that you used in a different part of the database. But again, everybody had a different solution to that. And I know that the decisions that we ended up making when I loaded the system have since been changed, because it just was too cumbersome. And so Melissa, who is the one who took over after me, has shifted how the archaeological cultures are handled in that lexicon, because of the challenges of working within that database. So that's a lot of what we're trying to bring to bear on this, is that, you know, databases they're tools, right? And so part of it is that there's only so much information and detail that you can really put into these systems, because you want to be able to search, right? You want to be able to track, and it is a tool to find groups of items, but then at the same time you want to find a way to use that tool to get you to an even clearer, more specific part of detail. And that's the hard part. It's the finding both, so that you can find both the group and the one unique thing. So there's a lot of different ways to handle that. I think as far as what we're trying to figure out right now is what to start with first in terms of what to tackle, whether it's object names or whether it's culture group names. we have different ideas about it. So that's something that we're definitely looking for input on, and it might mean that we just have different teams of people working on different aspects of this. But we feel like those are essentially the two main issues that people have really been struggling with. And besides that, I think the database concerns, the only other thing that I wanted to mention was some folks' databases aren't able to handle hierarchies properly in a certain way, and so I think a lot of what we have to figure out is how to generate something that can be used by everybody, if that's possible. That might be a really, really high bar to set, but here we are. We've already been told that we're a little crazy to try to do this because what? It's been for decades. As we keep doing research on this, we hear about how for decades people have been saying this is something that needs to be dealt with. This is something that needs to be dealt with. How are we going to deal about this? We're going to do something. Well, yeah, we might be a little crazy. So this is just to kind of wrap it all up in a little package. So we want something that's easily accessible. To be honest, I think one of the things with Nomenclature that maybe is frustrating Amy is that she can't get her hands on it because it's a book. That's, if you're not familiar with it, it's like that big. And so personally, I like that the Getty vocabularies are online. And if you're sitting there doing something and you need help, you can just pop online and go search, and it's there. And I think that's pretty lovely. But whatever it is that we determine, I think that, again, this is all part of the discussion. What is an easily accessible format? Something that's free, that would be perfect, because we all know that everybody's strapped for money. And something that's easily searchable, that you can find what you're looking for. Again, tackling those issues of, I mean, if you really start thinking about all the quirky terms that everybody's going to have out there and how do you document those all in one field, that's going to be a beast. And the universality of use, what I mean there is, again, it's that we have these systems that are being used by everybody from, a high school student doing a research paper to some of our, volunteers, internal volunteers. We have curatorial, we have tribal researchers, we have everybody who's working within these systems, and so how do we address different parts of this work to each of them so that it's useful across the board. And the building off existing standards, we don't necessarily want to start from scratch. So part of this is us hoping that there is a solution that we can bridge across all of these different, the Park Service and Getty and Nomenclature, and I mean, there's so many. So that is the hope, is that we would be able to start off of that there's so much work that has been done with those systems. So we're hoping to see if that will work. And again, having it be a collaborative process. I think one of the things that we have definitely talked about, and I really hope that we can make it happen, is to have it be something that can, like the Getty, actually, you're able to submit on their website once you get a password from them. You can submit updates. And so I think to have something like that where this is something that would be online and we could essentially tell people, if you want to help add information from your perspective, go and add information that way. But again, we'll see how it all works out. So again, this is where we are now. I think you already covered some of this. We have 4 people on the task force, but we were thinking, we're aiming to have like 10 people as far as kind of the main team, and then a group of folks that would help with the work. And so that's why we're going through and going to all these different conferences and asking for input from people and for volunteers. If anybody really, really is itching to help with lexicon, the fact that you guys are here at this, when you have like 14 other sessions, tells me that you at least care mildly about vocabularies. So But so yes, we are gathering examples. We as part of the survey, asked people to send us, if they felt comfortable, their vocabularies, so that we could look at them and see if they wanted to participate, to try and give us information as to how they came to those systems that they developed. The gathering help is, I have a pad of paper, so if you want to, or give me your card, and we've just been gathering folks and adding people to a mailing list, and we will be in touch about that. And the hope is, and I'll show you in a minute the website. Right now we are completely just volunteers, and we're being hosted right now by the Registrar's Committee, and this is our website now, which we just got on Tuesday. This is brand new. This is very exciting. So essentially, if you go to rcaam.org, and then you can navigate down to, there's a task force section, and then there's a couple different ones, and we're the Lexicon Task Force. And this gives you, also, there's the link down at the bottom to the survey, if you want to do the survey for us. And there's also the contact information for our chair, so if you want to share anything later on. But right now, the RC is hosting us, and so we have this webpage, which is lovely. But the thought is that we have talked about writing grants to get more money, not more money, to get money, to get funding, to really do some of this work properly, and maybe to set up a separate website that would be able to handle what we need to do. So this is where you guys come in, because we want to hear, a lot of this is questions. We really are in such the beginning stages of what we're doing that we don't want to make any assumptions, to be honest, because that's how you get in trouble. And so the first question is, who do you guys think would be users and participants in this larger project?